Okay, let's make a start. So welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about the 3 elements to successful co-leadership. And this is based on my experience of coaching leadership teams in recent years and what I've seen particularly working and how they've come together to create this successful space of leading an organization together. So what I'd like to really enable you to take away from today is what does that look like? What are the keys to working better together? How do we rebuild those working relationships and friendships, or how do we build them in the first place? And how do we overcome that space of conflict that can happen in leadership teams when they're leading organizations together and be more robust as a team in future? As I was saying, this is part based on research, mainly based on experience from my recent years. So I hope you find the case studies interesting. They're both real. I will be doing my best to protect who was involved in those case studies, of course. So just a very quick step into what is around in the research. You have probably come across this because this has been around a while. Katzenbach's very well-established research around what do we need for a high-performing team? What are those conditions? And talking about, they're a real team. They're not just a group of people coming together who work in different spaces. They have a combined direction, something that's common, and a purpose that they all share. They are the right people in that team. So we've got the kind of right people at the table with the right skills, and they have that clarity around structure. And not just that, but there's the wider context as well. I'm going to talk a little briefly about systems, but there's the system the team sits within, whether that's within an organization or the organization as a whole. What is that wider system? How does that support the team? And they become competent, because this is what we're trying to do in this space of development coaching. We're trying to enable the team members to become competent at co-coaching, coaching each other and the team, and therefore kind of learn from the coach what is going on for them, how they can do that better. Now, the way I've kind of brought all the research together in a bit more of a simple way, I like to simplify things when I work with things. It makes things a lot more easier to work with. So I kind of look at it from 2 perspectives, at the outer workings of a team and the inner workings of the team. Now, today I'm going to talk a lot about the inner workings of a team, but what I mean by the outer workings is, what is that wider system? It's all the kind of tangible things around the team that support the team working. What are the goals? What are the purpose? Where do we agree with that? Do we have those set? Do we have those written down? Do we have measures around so we can see where we're getting to? Is the goal a financial goal? Is it more than a financial goal? Is it a growth goal? Is it a market goal? What are all the different dynamics to those goals? And are we clear about what processes we have in our teams? I will touch on processes when I come to kind of how we connect the inner back to the outer and our role in that. Now, the 2 teams I'm going to be talking about today are teams where they've set the organisation up together and they share it equally. There's not really a division of roles. Directors together in that sense, which is where, of course, it can be harder to define who is doing what and therefore who is making what decision. Hence why we have the issues that arise. And values. There's kind of the shared values of the team. There's also personal values. I will talk a little bit about values. Now, the other side of it, and I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail because it's going to be expanded in the case studies, is the inner workings of the team. And fundamentally, for me, it comes down to 3 things. It's what are those relationships like? How did they come together? And a lot of the work that I did with these 2 teams was around the relationship piece. It's almost like that grounding, that bedrock for a successful team. And I'll share with you some insights on how that can be resolved, fixed, made better. There's also the learning space. How are the team coming together, feeding back to each other, challenging each other, and creating space for learning? So they don't just keep repeating the same mistakes, having the same arguments, making the same decisions and then conflicting about it. And finally, communication. One of the key things in teams is once you've established what and connected and reconnected people and helped them build that trust. It's how are they communicating together? And part of that is imparting skills. So I'll talk a little bit about where I focused in terms of communication. But I thought it might be helpful just to see kind of, if I step back, where I'm coming from on this. So let me step into the case studies. So I'm just going to kind of take you through an overview of the materials I used with them. In this first team that I worked with, they'd set up their company. It was quite a recent, it would be about 4 years old now. It was a recent company. They were friends together. They knew each other because they worked in the same industry. And they kind of came together because they wanted to work on their own. They wanted that space to really grow and challenge themselves. They were good at what they did. And when they built this organization, they just shared the leadership responsibilities. They'd split it a little bit by, I'm good in that sector and you're good in that sector, the complementary sectors, but that was it. So a lot of the other parts of leading that organization were done together. Even things like, signing off expenses or deciding, making decisions about pension plans or decide, they did everything together in that sense. But the reason I started getting involved with them was because there was a lot of heated arguments. They were very vocal with each other. There was a lot of emotion. They disagreed a lot about decisions. And so even though the business was performing well, they were very worried they were hindering business growth, all of them. They wanted to talk about this. They wanted to fix this conflict and upset. And there wasn't anything particular they could pinpoint, which I thought was interesting. And unlike some teams where they go, that happened, and that's why we all fell out, that's where you can orientate around a topic. But when it's just more to do with the characters in the team, I think it's more complicated. So with this team, I stepped them into using something called StrengthScope. StrengthScope team was where we started to have a look, because we wanted to understand what were they bringing to the table. And I use this model to just kind of orientate where we're coming from. Where are we trying to go in terms of aspirations? What do we know about each other in terms of trust? How do we build an awareness of each other? And starting to look then later in the, and I'll show you some of the tools around this, what we did in terms of action. What does that look like? How do we make decisions? If we're often disagreeing on decisions and spending, for example, an hour talking about whether we have a fridge in the office, but about 20 minutes talking about whether we should be part, as a business, part of that networking event, which could lead to new business opportunities. Now, where do you think they should have been spending the time? More on the networking event, less on the fridge. But it's quite interesting how leaders choose to spend their time when they're decision making, when they're in conflict around what that looks like. So we spent a lot of time looking at that. What are they doing? Starting out with purpose, we spent time, what is our purpose? Why am I here? Why did I go self-employed? Why did I decide to set up in business with you as my friend and my business partner? And having some honest conversations about where they were coming from, what they were bringing to that table. And for all three of them, seeing that they all wanted this business to work. They had different expectations of each other and different expectations of the business. For some of them, it was just about, this business funds my lifestyle. For others, it was more, actually, I really want to see where I can go as a leader. I really want to grow a business. So we had to do that kind of really careful contracting around what they were expecting before we then stepped into looking at their strengths. You may have come across strengths before. Strengths are really thinking about what motivates and energizes people. So trying to find, we know what you want as business. We've agreed those common goals. You're very clear in your mind what the purpose is. We are clear what's needed in the organization, but actually what drives you, what motivates you. So when we started to step into their strengths, this was where it starts to uncover why we were seeing what we were seeing. So this is a StrengthScope profile. This is their StrengthScope profile. And we can see here that they had courage. So there's 24 strengths. This is where the different profiles have been mapped together. And when we get more than 70% of the team, it becomes a significant strength for that team, as in it's a common way of approaching things. So we can see here for this team, they all had courage, they all had persuasiveness. So you start to unpick, okay, so they're comfortable standing up for what they believe in and presenting their view. They're comfortable having that debate. Well, of course, that's going to arrive in that leadership team space as arguments and debate and emotions and having this space where they're kind of rubbing up against each other. So it's about recognizing that there's value in this, because the value to me that we really had to tease out was diversity of opinion will make you a much stronger business. You'll be much more agile. You'll respond to more opportunities quickly. You'll really get a sense of what's right and what's wrong, because you'll be able to debate it through. You'll be doing that thinking piece, not getting too stale, not staying in the rut that you might find that works as a business. So you'll be good with change because you're having that debate. What we had to lean into were those other strengths you can see, those other relational strengths. You can see we had relationship building and collaboration in a couple of people. And you can also see those other strengths where there's one person with the strength like decisiveness. So how did they lean into that more? So for example, if we know, we talked about who had a decisiveness strength, well, actually, could we encourage you to hold the agenda and get us moving? So we're making decisions and not just sitting on them and talking about an office fridge for an hour. How could we lean into this collaboration piece? Because actually we do want to work together. They did have the option of working on their own as independents, as consultants, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to work together. They wanted this to work. So what does that look like? What does collaboration look like for them? How can we make more of that and create that safe space for the debate? We looked at behaviours as part of this, because obviously it's what you feel, but then it's also what you do. And this particular diagnostic helped us look a little bit at their team habits. And you can see here we had some things we could really lean into, those green bars, so we can see these things were working well. Particularly, they felt they knew what their purpose was. It was meaningful, they understood it, they felt they could rely on each other for help and support. Which is interesting given the amount of debate that was going on. They still knew they were there for each other. And they were really committed to high standards, that accountability piece. This is one of the reasons the business was being so successful. They had a really strong reputation for quality. So what wasn't working, and you can see quite clearly, there were some elements of the trust that weren't working for them. They didn't feel they were able to share their ideas and views only openly and honestly, because they kept getting it shot down, or someone having an argument or picking a fight. I mean, even to the extent of tears and storming out of a room, that level of emotion for this team. And they didn't really understand what they were bringing to the table, which was interesting. They all had different experience and they were aware of that, but they really needed to get under the skin of what are our strengths? How do we complement? How do we really use those and trust those? So deep diving into that space of how they arrive with their strengths, what that looks like, how we could make more of that, and lots of exploration around that piece. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about strengths when I talk about the next team. So I'm going to step into a couple of the tools that we then explored with this team to really get some of these behaviours cemented. And of course, a big part of how we arrive and how we show up in this team environment as a leadership team is, where's my head at? Where are my emotions? And we had to kind of really start to think about, how do we help each other arrive in a space when we're in that team meeting and we're having a debate about something, where we stay on that positive mindset. So that's that path of possibility, where we're thinking about, okay, here's a decision we've got to make about the business. We've got to think about whether we're really going in this direction, or we're trying to grow this client base. How do we do that? Thinking about this from the perspective of, what are the choices here, and trusting that each other wants to be there, wants good quality service for their customers. We've done this activity in the first session where they made promises to each other. And they promised that they wanted to be there. They promised that they'd show up. They promised they'd be honest, knowing that some of that honesty is quite difficult to hear. So when you're in that space that you know that your business partners are going to be honest with you, even if they know that you're going to disagree with it. Actually, you can work with that. You can work with that, and you can think about, right, what can we do with that? Maybe it's approaching that from the space of curiosity. What are you talking about that I haven't understood yet? How can we bring that to the table? Because this is where this diversity of opinion really helped this team, rather than getting stuck in that path of limitation, that fixed mindset where I'm just getting dragged down. So we talked a lot about emotions. This was really important that this team learned how to manage that emotional space. And of course, we talked about kind of what triggers you to go below the line. When something happens in a meeting, what is it that someone else is saying? And we started to really air the grievances. Well, literally, when you say that, that has an impact on me. And my role really there as the coach and the facilitator was helping them have the conversations that just kind of fester and just sit below the surface and needed to be had. And we started to talk about, actually, what can you say? How can you support me? We even had like a gift of value. How can you support me so I stay in this positive emotional state? Now, of course, one of the things we had to do as part of this was talk about how we feed back to each other in the leadership team, to our wider team as well. And we had to develop their skills. I had to help them develop their skills in feedback. Because this was really important for this space, rather than for it getting into an aggressive space. Actually, how can we feed back to each other? Because we know from feedback, we need feedback, we love feedback. Feedback, for example, is just literally, thank you. Can you just say thank you that I picked that up while you were out of the office? Oh, okay, I didn't realize you were feeling a bit underappreciated. Sometimes it is in that, actually, if you're trying to do that on the finance system, why don't you try this instead? It's sharing each other. They were pretty good at that piece, sharing the experiences. They weren't so good at the appreciation, because it all kind of said without, they kind of, well, surely you know that I really like that about you. So we had to have lots of conversations about what they liked about each other, why they appreciated each other. And then we definitely had to do a piece around the evaluation. This is good, this isn't good. Now, one of the spaces in here that we had to really step into is how you do that in a way that isn't telling someone. Because you know yourself, if someone starts telling you what to do differently, it can be really irritating and annoying. So we had to explore this kind of space of, actually, there is the directive style. Why did you agree to that sign off on that new phone for our new starter? They're not even past their probation. Actually, let's pull that back into a more curious space. Can you tell me about what your reasoning was around that? Why was it appropriate for that new starter to have a mobile phone at that point? Can we just talk that through? Do we need to be thinking about having a policy here around what we do with new starters when they get various equipment? So trying to encourage them to move from that kind of directive space. They're all very confident in their opinion, and so this was a very natural space for them into this non-directive space where they're just creating those conversations so they can have the debate. And if they do need to give feedback, we looked at this model. You may have come across it in different ways. Obviously, if we want to do more of this, is quite easy. I want you to do more of this. The harder part, of course, is what we want to do differently. So getting them to really separate out, I'm really upset because you said that, to when you did that, when you told the new starter they could have a mobile phone because they didn't want to use their personal one, and you decided that that was fine and they could go and spend £200 on a phone without checking it with any of us, which means now we've got a precedence around this, and I'm really upset that you made that decision without me. I should have been consulted on that. I feel like you always ignore my decisions, and this is just an example, and you can see how it would build in that. So it was really kind of getting them to kind of step back from that and go, okay, let's stick with the behavior and let's explore the impact together. What is the impact of that person making that decision without the two of you? The other impact, of course, is there a benefit? They've just moved on a decision. You haven't had to have a 2-hour meeting about what we do with new starters. But is it important to have that conversation? So you can then have a discussion around the impact and the risks. So you can agree what behavior you can change. So of course, we were exploring all these different types of things in terms of working together. How are they defining those issues? Are they questioning each other? We talked a lot about questions, how they're making suggestions, how are they testing that, and how are they encouraging participation. So ultimately with this team, one of the things we were doing frequently and coming back to, and we still do now, actually, we still work together now, is look at what are our ways of behaving. Sometimes this is called a team charter. We tended to use it as team principles. What is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what does that actually look like? When we're going to disagree with an opinion, what does that actually look like? So hopefully you find that useful. I will talk briefly through the second team. I started working with the second team quite close to the end of working with this first team. So I will show you some of the other tools that I used for a similar kind of context, but they had been working in the company for a very long time. So a completely different company. They'd been working in it for years. They were also friends for that many of years. It was like 15, 18 years. We were talking a really long time, but they'd done a management buyout about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. And it was all very shaky. They shared the leadership, they'd shared the roles, but they were feeling the strain. What I found really interesting here was this business performance was being affected. So unlike the other team where ultimately the business performance would have been affected, but right now it wasn't, and they could see that they were limiting their business growth because of the leadership team falling apart. Here, the business was being affected and people were being impacted. There was quite a lot of stress. There was this feeling that they almost approached me from this perspective of, I don't know where they're coming from, the other people on this team. I think we might need to close this business. They were coming from that perspective. So again, starting from that space of, well, what is your purpose? Why are you here? And we really started to think about what's the history here? It was really important to be exploring the history with this team and what they expected from each other. They also worked remotely. They did not have an office together. So they worked in different parts of the UK. They all worked from home. Which had been driven by the pandemic. They had no central office, so they came together, but infrequently. And that was a really important part to this team's development, was we were coming together and we were talking about what is the history? What do we believe? Do I expect you to be available in the evening? And doing some contracting around some of that. Before we then started to look at this piece around what is going wrong. So for this team, looking at this model of Lencioni, I'm sure you're familiar with, looking at that and going, oh, that's us. We don't trust each other. We don't have conversations about conflict and challenge. Yeah, we're not sure if everyone's committed to this, and actually our results are poor. So really with this team, it was about taking them through these steps. How do we get them to trust each other again? I worked a lot in this space, and I'll show you how I did that. How do we get to a space where we can actually have healthy conflict? How do we make sure we're all committed to this? How are we holding each other to account so we can really achieve those goals? Now, trust is a really, really difficult area to be building. And I think it's almost like that elusive thing you're trying to find. But trust ultimately comes from knowing each other well and doing what you say you're going to do. And you may have come across this before. I love the way this model summarizes it. It's, are you credible? Do you know what you're going to do? Now, in both of these cases, the business leaders knew each other, were really, really experienced. Reliability, sometimes a bit patchy, particularly for this team. I'll say one thing, I might do another, because I didn't believe what we agreed. And intimacy is sharing something about myself. Now, they'd started to close down in terms of what they shared about themselves. The friendship, particularly between a couple of the business leaders, had really broken down. They weren't even talking to each other. So getting them in the same room was interesting and very much about what's going on for me. So we needed to start to get them out of the space of, I'm hurt by what's going on. I'm hurt by you letting me down. I'm hurt by you letting the business down. And we needed to get that on the table. So there was a lot in those early hours with them in those coaching sessions of getting them to talk about really what had gone on for them, what was going on for them, what they were experiencing, and sharing their stories with each other in a way that was honest. This was a really uncomfortable space initially, because obviously having those conversations that you never have in business. And what helped here was talking about values and really getting them to open up around why they work and why they're in this business. And what was really interesting was when we started to map out the values, we found overlap. They held almost all the same values. You know, it was really important to all of them that there was security, that they were looking after their family with what they were getting from the business. That wealth enabled that security and family piece, and it enabled them to have adventures. And they loved doing, again, for them, it was really important to do good things for clients in a creative way with honesty and integrity. So when we started to talk about, we take it right down to that baseline of why I'm here, this is where they start to go, oh, okay, you're here for the same reasons as me. And that starts to give us something to build on. So we could then talk about, what do we want as team behaviors? You know, and they wanted respect, they wanted communication, they wanted a sense of solidarity, they wanted to talk about their emotions. And you can see we did kind of like this post-it note exercise. And ultimately that leading to more money in this business. We talked about their strengths. So here you can see that again, they had courage as a strength, but that detail orientation was really interesting because that would delay a lot of their conversations, that would delay decisions. The flexibility and creativity often led to spaces of conflict because they'd go, oh, I'm just going to go do this instead. So they had almost no processes and they'd all do things differently. So we'll say, so it was about kind of how do we get more out of each other? And here for this team, I think the most important transition was stepping into the fact that feelings are part of business. Someone once said to me, feelings don't have a space in business. And I think in a leadership team, they absolutely do have a space in business, because that's what was blocking a lot of these behaviors. That's what was stopping them making the most of their strengths, because of how they felt about each other and what was going on inside for them. Their stress levels, their confidence levels, all of these things being affected by their feelings. So for them, it was stepping into the connection. You know, when something happens in your team and you're thinking about, okay, that happened and I have a reaction, what's that about? Where is that coming from? Why might I be saying that? Is that because of my childhood and what I had available or not available as a childhood? And that triggering these feelings, which then, of course, triggers these thoughts and our behavior, and them really getting to the bottom of this as a loop for them. Because if they, for example, say something on a WhatsApp that's dismissive of one of the other leaders around one of their decisions, and to the extent that that leader gets annoyed and exits the leadership WhatsApp group, this was happening on a regular basis, by the way, this kind of almost childish behavior, actually not seeing that this is all interlinked for them, that this loop, what they were doing in terms of how they felt, was connected to their behavior and their outcome. So we had to do a lot of unpicking of triggers and feelings and how that led to behavior. Now, just to kind of wrap up on some of the tools that I took this particular team to, because obviously it's once you've kind of established that, got the team retrusting and got them understanding where they're all coming from, it's then having some tools of how we interact as a leadership team. We talked a lot about communication in this team in the later sessions, and actually what does it look like? How, you know, what actually impacts our communication with each other? Because what we say, we had a lot of, well, I said this and you said that and I got really upset by that, and someone would say, well, oh, I didn't mean it like that. So there was an impression between two of the leaders that one of the leaders wasn't engaging and wasn't doing business development. And actually what was happening for that leader was they were feeling really unconfident because there was a bit of crisis going on in their part of the industry. And they'd reached out for help, they'd been rebuffed, so they just switched off and went, I don't know whether I want to do this anymore. And actually what had happened when they'd reached out, the rebuff hadn't meant as a rebuff. It was, I'm just too busy right now, can we get together next week? So that behavior had been misinterpreted. So we talked a lot about what happens in terms of communication and how it interferes. So that need to really kind of turn off our internal filters around communication. Of course, we explored a little bit about conflict styles and really started to map how do we get into this collaborating space? How do I arrive? We had lots of accommodating and avoiding going on in this particular team. What does collaborating look like? How do we have those healthy conflict conversations? What does that tangibly look like? And I think a real breakthrough for this particular team was this model of radical candor. Was really talking about what does radical candor look like for us as a team. So not kind of just being nice to each other, not being sarcastic, insincere, lots of that was going on, not being aggressive or angry, not so much of that for this team. But how do we be in that space of kindness where praise and criticism is all done in this kind manner? So for them, the outcome of this exploration, so this went over a period of 6 months, and I earlier this year, and then I've been back in touch with them and we've done a little bit more on a specific topic. But really they felt for them that it shifted in terms of their self. They became much more proactive. They felt they improved their skills. They started to reframe a lot of things and just built their active listening skills and learned to kind of filter that feedback. What does that look like? What does that mean for me? So they noticed that their relationships really shifted very quickly in those early days of actually, I'm going to seek to understand and appreciate what you're saying, even if that's a different view to me. I'm going to start to understand how we play to our strengths and how do we become joined up and really trust each other and respect our boundaries. So to pull this all together, in the final piece I want to talk to you, just kind of share with you, was how in my mind, how this led to what, the 3 elements that are really fundamental. And the first thing is this openness and transparency. You can hear what we talked about, what we shared, there was a lot around creating openness and honesty. Let's have those conversations that we've never had. Let's talk about the things that nobody talks about and really clear the air and discuss what that looks like going forward. So that openness and transparency coming from that space of that trust. Because if I can trust that what you say is honest and true, then we can move forward from there. And then the second element to what I noticed from the research, but from these case studies, is this real deep understanding of each other and mutual respect for each other. I know why you're here in work and I know your values and I understand those. I understand your strengths. So we don't compete. The second team, we're very big into competing with each other. We complement each other in the leadership team. And then on the bedrock of those 2 pieces is actually, what does this look like? What are our behaviors? How do we make decisions? How do we seek new business? How do we set goals? How do we manage people? And really building their skills in the behaviors, but doing that once they've got the relationship piece fixed. So I will, so if you want to know more about this, I will break to questions in a minute. If you want to know more, there's my contact details there. In terms of how I worked with these teams, there's a couple of different ways, and you can find out more if you're interested. One way is these kind of team coaching half-day sessions. So with the second case study, this is how we approached it, that kind of working through where you are, building individual understanding, building an understanding of team strengths, and then building the team off the back of that. The other team I worked with had more of a one-to-one piece in the middle. So we started with that, where are we now? Then we had a one-to-one coaching space of really self-exploration and impact before we then stepped back into that team space. So I'll now stop sharing the slides and open up to any questions and any discussion.